Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you're new here, my name is Tian and I'm an aspiring software developer. In today's video, I wanted to show you guys some of the Python basic concepts, especially in regards to the different types of numbers that Python uses and how to get a user input and several ways that you could produce your first very basic Python program. As you guys can see here on my screen, I have my PyCharm editor opened up. Let me just close the project tab so you guys can see that a bit better. Good. Okay. And within my PyCharm, I just wanted to first walk you guys through some of the basic types of numbers that Python uses. And any Python developer should know the difference between continuous and discrete and would be able to be selective on what they want to have in their program. The way that I'm going to approach this is to comment out the types of numbers that Python uses, and it will be a lot easier for you guys to follow along. As you can see, when I'm typing certain letters and spaces between these three words and a little colon over here, Python would have this red line underneath. That's okay for now because I am going to comment these out anyways. In Python, when you are looking at the different types of numbers that Python has, there are 5 main types of numbers. Natural, so like 1, 2, and 3. You also have got your rational number, so like -1 is, like -1 divided by like over 1. 0, for example, would be like 0 over 1, and 0.5 would be 0.5 would be a half. You've also got your integers, so those are like including the negative number and the positive number. You've also got your irrational, so those are like your irrational. So you've got like your square root, square root of 2. You've also got your pi, so like 3.14, and the final one is reals, so like it covers irrational and rational. Those are the types of numbers in Python. Now I'm just gonna comment out and leave it there so you guys could like refer it back in my GitHub. Now, in terms of continuous, choosing continuous is when you are working on a program that requires your numbers to be measurable. So it's like measurable things. So for example, if you're working on a program that asks for the weight, the length, or the speed of a certain object, you would refer to the continuous. And when you're using continuous, you would use reals number because it covers, for example, if the program asks you to get the weight of something and reals has irrational or rational, whereas discrete numbers happens with like only whole number things. So for example, you're counting something, so like whole number things, especially when you're counting. I forgot. Python recognizes this in, for example, if you're doing like a string, that right there would require you to end the string like this. So all of this will be in a string, but at the moment I'm just gonna like move this. You can choose to use a special character in Python to ignore that string, so you can have a single quotation mark like you are, which is enclosed within a double quotation mark. In future videos, when there is a specific example, I'll show you guys how to use special characters in Python. Now let's get back to this, especially when you're counting. You would then use naturals or integers. Oh, and another thing, you see how this is highlighted in, like a bluish color, or is a Python keyword. So if you use naturals or integer, it's one or another. Again, in future videos, if we come across an example that use and or not, I'll be able to explain to you guys what those keywords mean specifically. Again, I'm just gonna comment this out, so you guys can always refer back to it in my GitHub. Oh, my bad, continuous. Another thing about PyCharm is, if you have a mistake like continuous, you see that line right there. It's not big of a deal, but if you want to be specific about your English, then just right click on it, show context action, and fix typo. Again, you would have different variables that don't exactly spell out an English word, so take it or leave it. Yeah. Onto inputs. Inputs is one of the very basic Python function that allows you to do a whole range and variation of different things. Usually inputs is used for if you have a user using your programs, they would probably want to input say for example their name or their location, and not having to follow a pre-programmed output. And I think that inputs is one of those functions that is extremely useful for any sort of programming, from basic programming to object-oriented programming. Inputs is super easy to use. For example, if, there it is again, this is a variable and it stands for first name. Same similar thing that happened to continuous, but I'm just gonna leave it there. And you type an input and you have these brackets, and you can have a question or a statement in there that says your first name, and then you could print that first name variable, which is set to equal to the input, the user input, and you can run it and say, for example, my first name is Tian. That's how you make an input for Python. It's super easy, super flexible. You can do a lot with it. This is a bit advanced for you guys right now, but if you use the split, the split function, which splits the input into like a list of, you see, that is a list. So Tian is put into a list. Now, why am I doing inputs, but I spoke about numbers first? Well, here's the thing about Python. For example, if you want to take an integer input, like this, and change that to age, your age, this means you're asking the user to input in their age within like an integer. So the input is stored within the integer so that the input changes into an integer. However, if you don't have an integer here, but you have like a floating point, which is like a decimal or a string, what do you think that would happen? So let's do this first. I have to print it, my bad. So right there, 21. Now, what do you think will happen if you have a string instead of an integer? It comes out as an error, and it explains why. It's a value error because this string is invalid literal for integer with base 10. Python normally would use base 10 in the program when you want to like output something, but you can do hexadecimal and binary with other bases as you want. You just have to construct your program in accordance to that. In my university courses and my my other Python programs, I haven't touched binary or hexadecimal or octal as much with different bases, so I don't have a lot of experience in that realm. But if you guys have more experience than me, please let me know if my understanding is incorrect. That would be like super appreciated, because you're helping me and helping others at the same time, which is, I think it's beautiful. Okay, now here's another thing. What if your input is in a floating point number, so it's like a decimal number? What do you think is going to happen? Let's try it out. 21.5, that's a decimal number. Again, value error. But the interesting thing is, floating point number actually has its own function, which, if you look at this, it's just knowing what you want for your expected output and the steps to get there. So, for those who want to check out the GitHub Python file for this specific episode, I am just going to, I'm just going to leave a comment here and be like, int h float input your age, float age. Now here's my question. I have declared an age variable up here and have it to be printed out like this. And then I have this exact same variable here, but it's a float. Do you think my program will run? And what's going to happen if my program run or crashes? What's the output for both of the programs? Let's see. It asked me again. But this time, it's asking for a float. It didn't crash. Let me tell you why. Python works like this. If you declared age up here and you print, then this print that is occurring at this specific moment is printing for the age that the variable age that you declared up here. And if you go down here, it's a separate one because it's accessing a separate memory location, and it's printing that specific age for the float, which is this variable. I'll show you what I mean. ID here is returning, as you can see, the identity of an object. This is guaranteed to be unique among simultaneously existing objects. So it's accessing the memory's location of that specific object, which is age, but with the integer, and the different age down here with the float will be different with the age up here with the integer. The memory's location will be completely different. I'll show you what I mean. That is the memory location for the age up here. But this is the memory's location for the age down here. You see how they're relatively the same, but then they're different. If you're building a large project, a large project larger than this one, then I'll be extremely careful with how I name my variables, because things like this will happen, and then you'll be super confused as to how your output is not the output that you have expected. That's input for you. Now let's take it up another level and introduce you to this concept of a Sentinel pattern. What is a Sentinel pattern? Well, that pattern is used when you're unsure of the amount of user inputs are needed until a condition is met. So, for example, if you're constructing a program where you're reading the positive amount of marks and you want to print that the amount of marks entered and the average of that specific marks, but any marks less than 0, so like any negative marks, will make the program to stop. That logic, the pattern that I'm introducing you guys right now, is super useful. I have used this pattern in my exam, in my quizzes, in my assignments, in like my personal Python projects. And that pattern, you can program pretty much anything with it. It only stops working when your condition is met, which is insanely useful for you if you want to construct bigger Python projects than this one. So right now I'm just gonna program the example that I have just given, which is the user will enter as many marks as they want. The output will calculate the amount of marks entered and its average, and it will calculate the average and the amount of marks entered when the user enters a negative number. First, I'm just gonna have a variable that will help me to calculate the average of marks. How do you calculate the average of something? You would need to add all of what has been entered and the length of what has been entered. And so I'm just gonna do something like this real quickly. Now let's have a little comment here that says this program calculates number of entered positive marks and its average. So myself, 5 weeks from now, would remember what this program is about and what I wrote. Now the interesting thing is, remember how I said there are different types of numbers, and within that types of numbers there is a floating point. You can initialize the variables this way. So n is my entered, the amount of entered marks, and the total, which will help me to calculate the sum of the entered marks. And I could separate it by having n comma total equals to 0, which is the 0 would be for n, and total would be for 0.0. And this is to initialize the variables that I'm going to be using for my program. Now the program would ask the user to enter the marks with mark equals to float input, which you already understand up here. If you don't, you can always rewind the video. Now I'm gonna introduce you to it's not really advanced, but it's just the concept of loops, which I will have a separate video talking about the 2 different loops that Python uses. For a while loop, for example, a while loop is an example of an indefinite loop. What is an indefinite loop? Well, an indefinite loop is when a program can't know the amount of required iterations, so it is repeated until a condition is met, which aligns well with the Sentinel pattern because you wouldn't know how many times the user will input until a certain condition is met. As I said earlier, this program will calculate the numbers of positive marks. So anything below 0.0 will be negative. So the logic would be, if mark is greater or equal to 0.0, right? Because you're entering just only the positive marks. So if mark is greater than 0.0. Now, to end a statement in Python, this is, how you would use it. I personally like the TypeScript syntax better, or the JavaScript syntax where you end it with the curly brackets, but that's Python and I would stick with it because I think that's pretty neat too. How do you measure or how do you count the amount of entered marks? Well, every time the user enter a new mark, you're just incrementing that mark, right? So you remember how in my last video I did this for my speed and the angle of the spinning yin yang? That is, or like this, that is a shorthand way of incrementing certain things. So, for example, if I want to keep track of the entered amount of marks, then I just have to increment it by 1. If I don't want to use a shorthand, I can always use this. The same logic, but I like the shorthand one better because it just looks cooler, I think, for me personally. Now to calculate the sum of marks, I just have to do total equal to the new mark plus or add the old mark. So it would be like, that will be the logic. Total equal to mark plus mark. New mark plus old mark. Like, you remember how I said in the beginning, this statement is to initialize mark? Well, that is the first instance the user will see of mark, and then it will be used here. But this is a loop, it's an indefinite loop, so you don't know how many instances the user would input. So you have to do it like this again to be able to have the user to input until they input a negative mark. So let's just comment this out for a little bit. So yeah. And I need a print statement, don't I? Yeah, I need a print statement to see the mark, the total mark, and the entered amount of mark, don't I? Yeah. Okay. Now let's see. 10. 1, 2, 3, -1. 10 plus 1 plus 2 plus 3 divided by 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. 4. So let me bring up my calculator. Not my calendar, but my calculator. And let's see this. 2, 3. That is what I have so far, which is accurate. So far, I've only done the total. I haven't done like the average yet, which is I'm just still printing total, which is accurate, and then printing the amount of marks entered, which is also accurate. Now let's do the average. The average, like I said in the beginning, would only be total divided by the amount of marks entered. So let's do it again. Correct. Now see, this program wouldn't work if -1 would be your only mark. And you can't really have a negative mark be the only entered mark, right? So Python has, like any other programming languages, they would have the if conditions. So what you would want to do is to have an if condition that says if the entered mark is greater than 0, which is true, then you would be like the average at the end would be total divided by n. However, if this is not the case, then you would be like there were no marks entered. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, -1. True. Oh, I forgot to print the amount of entered marks, which is just n right here. My bad. 10, 1, 2, 3, -1. True. Now, let's try -1 again. What do you know? No marks. Pretty neat, right? I think it's pretty neat too. And the fact that, within this short video, we have covered pretty much a lot of the Python basic grounds, like the types of numbers, or choosing between using continuous or discrete, and having the different inputs style. So like the input translating into an integer and the input translating into a float, and understanding why that happens when you have the same variable and you're printing the different things, but it would still run. But still, it would not be recommended that you use the same variables, the same spelling and everything within a larger Python project, because at the end of the day, when you're developing something, you just want to make sure that it's super easy to understand, and that you in like 10 weeks time after you have just first started developing a certain project, going back to it, you would understand what is the expected output and how to fix the project if there is any bugs. And the concept of a Sentinel pattern translating an input into a flow, and having the different if conditions that would support printing the expected output for the Sentinel pattern. But that's it for me. I would highly recommend that you try out new things, changing the objective of certain programs I have, and just experimenting with the different patterns and the different if conditions and the different style of printing the different inputs. And do expect future Python videos to introduce the different loops I have, in which the objective of this video wasn't to introduce loops. So do expect that video to come out really soon. But that's it from me. I hope you guys learned a thing or two throughout this video, and I'll see you guys next time. Until then, stay safe everybody, and yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!